It's important to note that dictatorship and tyranny are not positive or admirable forms of government. Dictators who have ruled with an iron fist and committed grave human rights violations have caused immeasurable harm to their citizens and society as a whole. Here are a few of the most notorious and tyrannical dictators in history. These are just a few examples of dictators who have caused immense suffering and harm through their tyrannical rule. It's important to remember the atrocities committed by these leaders and work to prevent similar abuses of power in the future. Adolf Hitler, German politician and leader of the Nazi Party, who rose to power as Chancellor of Germany in 1933 and later became the country's dictator. Hitler's regime was responsible for the systematic persecution, imprisonment, and murder of millions of people, including 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. Hitler was a fervent nationalist who believed in the superiority of the Aryan race and the need for Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. He saw Jews and other minority groups as threats to the purity and strength of the German nation and implemented policies to eradicate them. Hitler's aggressive expansionist policies led to World War II, in which he pursued military conquests throughout Europe until his suicide in his bunker in Berlin in April 1945, as Allied forces closed in on the city. His legacy remains one of the most devastating and catastrophic in human history. Joseph Stalin, Soviet politician who became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1922 and went on to become the country's dictator. Under Stalin's leadership, the Soviet Union rapidly industrialized and modernized, but at great human cost. Stalin implemented policies that led to the deaths of millions of people, including the forced collectivization of agriculture, which caused mass starvation in Ukraine and other parts of the Soviet Union. He also oversaw purges of perceived political enemies, which led to the imprisonment, torture, and execution of millions of people. During World War II, Stalin played a crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany, but after the war, he established Soviet control over Eastern Europe through puppet regimes and harsh repression. Stalin's leadership style was marked by paranoia, cruelty, and absolute control, and his legacy remains one of the most controversial in modern history. Mao Zedong, Chinese communist revolutionary and politician who led the People's Republic of China from its establishment in 1949 until his death in 1976. Mao's leadership was marked by a commitment to socialist revolution, economic development, and the eradication of what he saw as feudal and bourgeois elements in Chinese society. Mao's policies included the collectivization of agriculture and the establishment of communes, which led to widespread famine and the deaths of millions of people. He also launched campaigns against perceived enemies of the state, including intellectuals, capitalists, and political rivals, leading to the imprisonment, torture, and execution of millions of people. Mao's leadership also had positive aspects, including the promotion of gender equality, the expansion of education, and the development of infrastructure and industry. Pol Pot, Cambodian revolutionary and politician who led the Khmer Rouge, a communist organization that seized power in Cambodia in 1975. Under Pol Pot's leadership, Cambodia underwent a radical social and economic transformation with the goal of creating a communist, agrarian utopia. Pol Pot's policies included the forced evacuation of cities, the abolition of money and private property, and the establishment of collectivized agriculture. These policies led to widespread famine, disease, and the deaths of an estimated 1.7 to 2.2 million people, or roughly 1/4 of the Cambodian population. Pol Pot's regime was also marked by brutal repression, with perceived enemies of the state, including intellectuals, professionals, and ethnic minorities, being subjected to torture, forced labor, and execution. The Khmer Rouge was eventually ousted from power in 1979 by Vietnamese forces, and Pol Pot spent the rest of his life in hiding, with his death coming in 1998. Saddam Hussein, Iraqi politician who served as the president of Iraq from 1979 until his overthrow and capture by U.S. forces in 2003. Saddam's regime was characterized by authoritarian rule, suppression of political opposition, and human rights abuses. During his time in power, Saddam Hussein oversaw several conflicts, including the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s and the Gulf War in 1990 to 1991. His regime was also accused of using chemical weapons against both Iranian forces and Iraqi civilians, and of committing atrocities against ethnic and religious minorities, particularly the Kurdish people. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, alleging that Saddam Hussein was in possession of weapons of mass destruction, which were never found. Saddam was captured by U.S. forces and later executed by the new Iraqi government in 2006. Idi Amin, Ugandan military officer who came to power in a military coup in 1971 and ruled Uganda as a dictator until his overthrow in 1979. Amin's regime was characterized by extreme brutality, corruption, and human rights abuses. During his time in power, Amin implemented policies that targeted political opponents, ethnic minorities, and religious groups. His regime was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 300,000 Ugandans, and he became notorious for his use of torture and extrajudicial killings. Amin's leadership also had international ramifications, with Uganda's relations with neighboring countries, particularly Tanzania, deteriorating under his regime. Amin was eventually forced into exile in 1979 after a coalition of Ugandan exiles and Tanzanian forces invaded the country and overthrew his government. He spent the remainder of his life in exile, mainly in Saudi Arabia, until his death in 2003. His legacy is one of the most brutal and oppressive in African history. Bashar al-Assad, current president of Syria, having succeeded his father, Hafez al-Assad, in 2000. Assad's regime has been characterized by authoritarian rule, suppression of political opposition, and human rights abuses. Assad's leadership has been marked by a civil war that began in 2011 after the Syrian government cracked down on peaceful protests calling for greater democracy and civil liberties. The conflict has since escalated into a complex and protracted war involving multiple factions, including government forces, opposition groups, and international actors. Assad's regime has been accused of committing numerous human rights violations during the conflict, including the use of chemical weapons against civilians. The conflict has also resulted in the displacement of millions of Syrians and a humanitarian crisis. Assad has received support from Russia and Iran, while Western countries and many Arab states have opposed his regime. Nicolae Ceausescu, Romanian politician who served as the General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party and as President of Romania from 1967 until his overthrow and execution in 1989. Ceausescu's regime was characterized by authoritarian rule, suppression of political opposition, and human rights abuses. He implemented policies that aimed to rapidly modernize Romania, including large-scale industrialization and urbanization programs, but also included the forced relocation of rural populations and the suppression of cultural and ethnic identities. Ceausescu's regime was also marked by widespread corruption, economic mismanagement, and a cult of personality that glorified the leader as a national hero. His rule came to an end in December 1989, when a series of protests and uprisings swept the country. Ceausescu and his wife were captured and executed by firing squad on December 25, 1989. Kim Jong-un, current supreme leader of North Korea, having succeeded his father, Kim Jong-il, in 2011. Kim Jong-un's regime has been characterized by authoritarian rule, suppression of political opposition, and human rights abuses. Under Kim Jong-un's leadership, North Korea has continued to pursue its nuclear weapons program in defiance of international sanctions and pressure. The regime has also been accused of engaging in cyber attacks and exporting weapons to other countries. Robert Mugabe, Zimbabwean politician who served as the country's prime minister from 1980 to 1987 and as its president from 1987 to 2017. Mugabe's regime was characterized by authoritarian rule, suppression of political opposition, and human rights abuses. Mugabe played a leading role in the struggle against colonial rule in Rhodesia, which later became Zimbabwe. He became a hero to many Zimbabweans for his role in securing independence, but his leadership was increasingly criticized for its corruption and mismanagement. Under Mugabe's rule, Zimbabwe experienced economic decline, political repression, and electoral fraud. The regime was also accused of committing numerous human rights violations, including the use of torture and extrajudicial killings. These are just a few examples of the many tyrannical dictators in history who have caused untold suffering and harm to their citizens. It's important to remember their atrocities and work to prevent such abuses of power in the future.